Kalorama, a Recorded Books High Bridge imprint, presents The American Imperative, Reclaiming Global Leadership Through Soft Power, by Daniel Runde, read by Kent Klineman. Introduction. Who will lead? Our adversaries are intensifying their efforts in the entire underdeveloped world. Those who oppose their advance look to us, and I believe at this dangerous moment we must respond. John F. Kennedy, upon the signing of the Foreign Assistance Act of 1961. In 1992, the year after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the political scientists Francis Fukuyama published The End of History and The Last Man. This seminal work of political philosophy argued that civilization had reached the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as the final form of human government. The world was experiencing a wave of democratization, not just in the former Soviet states in Eastern and Central Europe, but also in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Fukuyama believed, as I do, that market democracies are the best foundation for moral, social, and economic progress, and that the liberal world order that had come into being after the Second World War, which I believe has kept humanity free from global conflagration for 75 years, would be cemented as the fundamental organizing principle of geopolitics. World events have shocked the world out of the complacency that followed Fukuyama's optimistic prediction. After several years spent observing with concern the democracy recession around the world, the U.S. and its partner nations saw the liberal world order come under all-out attack in 2022 with Russia's barbaric, catastrophic invasion of Ukraine. What had been a sleepy multilateral system roared back to life, brandishing the weapons of diplomatic, economic, and cultural connections. When I set about writing a book about great power, competition, and the growing threat to the liberal world order, I focused my attention primarily on China, or more specifically, the Chinese Communist Party. China's rapidly spreading influence has made it the second largest economy on the planet. But even as Beijing hosted the 2022 Winter Olympics, Russia, in the authoritarian grip of Vladimir Putin, grabbed the headlines. I fervently hope that we are not at the beginning of a second Cold War, but without question, the great power competition facing the United States has become more complex and more urgent. Russia and China are going to be challenges for the next 20 or 30 years, but they are not one and the same. Each has its own intentions and motivations, and the response of the U.S. and its partners will have to be multifaceted and draw on every tool at our disposal. Our long-term goal for U.S. leadership is a world based on broadly shared liberal values and ideals, not those of China or Russia, and we should work to pull as many countries as possible toward that liberal international order, assuming those countries want to join. The world is, for the moment, distracted by Moscow's aggression, but we need to be careful not to take our eye off the ball. Russia may be a local bully, reasserting its presence in the former Soviet space, but it has neither the economic might nor the ability to set global standards that China has achieved. Yet Russia insists on being recognized as a global force. The great power competition currently taking shape is not going to play out in Beijing or Moscow, though, but rather in places like Kyiv and across the developing world, from Central Asia to Africa and Latin America. Before the Ukraine invasion, we assumed this competition would not be fought with armies, but rather with ideas and economic engagement. In the words of former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, if we can avoid war with Russia and China, our rivalry with them will be waged using non-military instruments of power, the same kind of instruments that played a significant role in winning the Cold War: diplomacy, development assistance, strategic communications, science and technology, ideology, nationalism, and more. I think about the United States' relationship with the world as being supported by a tripod of 3 Ds: diplomacy, defense, and development. My field is development, which is linked inextricably to the other 2 elements as a critical component of statecraft. A great deal of attention is going to be paid to military and security issues, with many already arguing for a revitalized, technologically advanced military. I don't believe, though, that global leadership is going to be asserted primarily on the battlefield, but rather through economic and other soft power tools. The international response to Putin's assault on Ukraine has been a testament to the importance of diplomacy, as democracies have reinvigorated their commitment to liberal principles and have made clear their united opposition to Russian aggression. At the same time, the human tragedy in Ukraine should make us reflect on our assumptions about how we engage with the world and how we apply various forms of power in concert with our allies. In Ukraine, the tools of soft power and development will be needed to help restore the functionality of institutions and respond to the humanitarian crisis, and later to help a war-torn country rebuild and have deep, long-term political, economic, and people-to-people relationships with the West. Every American, from elected policymakers in Washington to informed citizens everywhere, needs to understand the full array of tools and opportunities available to us to exercise American leadership in these international undertakings. In a March 3, 2022 statement, Robert Gates wrote persuasively of the need to awaken democratic governments to the reality of a new world. In that statement, he pointed out, another crucial non-military instrument, as we have seen in recent days, is our alliances and the power inherent in acting together. 2 of the most important agencies during the Cold War were the United States Information Agency, Strategic Communications, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, Economic Assistance. We need creatively to reinvent both, and other critical non-military instruments of power for the global struggle in which we are now engaged. While Russia licked its wounds for 30 years, the rise of China as an economic and geopolitical force was so swift that the governments that traditionally dominated the world stage were essentially caught napping. The end of the Cold War seemed to offer a lull, a peace dividend that allowed the West to reorder its priorities, which meant relaxing its guard. China rushed in to fill the empty spaces created during that time of transition. Before the United States and its allies opened their eyes, the once insular China had reached out and established its presence on every continent, and it had begun systematically building its own future with the world's resources. 20 years ago, many observers viewed China as a developing nation, culturally and politically isolated and opaque. By the early 2020s, however, China could boast of being the leading trading partner for 124 countries, while the United States could claim only 76. Chinese companies have built infrastructure and invested in energy projects throughout the developing world, while also setting up new multilateral development banks and actively competing with the U.S. and the West for influence and authority in global organizations. I've watched this taking shape over my 20 years in development work. Now I feel I must raise the alarm. The discussion of soft power and how we use it needs a major refresh. And we also need a reset of all our assumptions for this new post Cold War landscape. This is an entirely new kind of superpower competition. Over the course of this book, I will detail the economic and demographic forces driving Beijing's hegemonic agenda, as well as the tools and techniques it uses to achieve its goals. To see this new dynamic as a return to the perilous days of the Cold War would be misguided. Russia may be hoping to reclaim past glory, but China isn't looking to export ideology or gather military allies into its camp. Rather, Beijing has engaged in the multilateral system and is seeking to reshape it according to its needs. It is an exaggeration to say that Chinese leadership has set a goal of upending the liberal world order, but both China and Russia have been working to revise it in ways we are not going to like, unless you're a fan of rigged plebiscites, systemic corruption, unfettered pollution, and religious persecution as state policy. Should the current world order become obsolete, it won't be the result of some nefarious Chinese plan to sabotage the West. It will be due to the West's, and particularly to the United States' inattention, complacency, and lack of deep examination into what motivates the next great superpower and its Russian partner. With China ascendant in the 21st century, I believe that there is now one great overarching goal of American soft power to enable a better alternative to all that China is offering to the developing world as a means of preserving the multilateral system that sustains prosperity. This will not happen overnight, and it cannot be addressed by short-term thinking, planning, or budgeting. I expect a 30 to 40-year marathon, which will involve reinvigorating global alliances and promoting the strengthening of economies and governance in more and more countries so that they will have broadly shared the interests and values and also be able to share the burdens of meeting global challenges. I envision a prosperous world that is increasingly democratic, in which people can achieve their individual dreams and societies can achieve their deepest hopes and aspirations. In that world, the United States should lead an updated liberal international order. While this order will need to include some burden-sharing shifts among our friends and allies, it also requires that the U.S. continue to play a leadership role and accept the costs and responsibilities of maintaining global leadership. Our response to the current Russia challenge could offer a roadmap for our approach to China. Even though Russia offers no compelling economic vision, the United States and its allies can offer a meaningful development alternative based on freedom and prosperity. That vision has suffered some setbacks in recent years after our problems in Iraq and Afghanistan, the global financial crisis, the widespread democracy recession, and troubles at home. But warts and all, we must continue to stand up for these ideals. That's going to require efforts across multiple fronts: democracy, human rights, and governance, continued reform of the state sector, market-based economic reforms, continued reform of the energy and power sectors, and many other forms of soft power engagement. Additionally, we must remember that our rivalries are with government regimes, not with civil populations. It is with Vladimir Putin and the Chinese Communist Party, and not with the Russian or Chinese people. The U.S. should also find ways to support civil society and human rights in Russia and China. Our policy should not be regime change, despite Putin's deeply inhumane policies, but rather to support and give voice to the millions of Russians and Chinese who wish for a better future based on openness and fundamental freedoms. In the chapters that follow, I will show how important it is that the United States organize and lead global coalitions of the willing while remaining a standards maker, not a standards taker. I will offer a brief historical perspective, explaining the steps and missteps that brought us to this present juncture, to better inform our strategy for the immediate future. If the keys to enduring peace and prosperity are political and social stability, economic vigor, and self-sufficiency for a continually increasing number of countries, development offers the best path forward. Foreign assistance is only one small piece of the puzzle, but it is critical in that it catalyzes progress in what I believe are the two most important factors in development: a strong private sector, often working in partnership with public institutions, and effective governance operating in a context of democracy. If we have learned anything in 2022, it's that the United States cannot afford to turn its gaze inward. The mechanisms of the multilateral system may operate outside the realm of most people's consciousness, but there is no overstating the extent to which we all rely on that system and therefore need to ensure that it functions well. We will likely need to go back to the drawing board, not only on our use of multilateral financial institutions, but on energy policy and commercial diplomacy as well. The rules of the game may not yet be perfect, but one thing is certain: we would not like the rules as China would rewrite them. It is time to reconsider our international relationships with our traditional allies as well as with countries with which we've had fraught relations. The challenges ahead are substantial and require both immediate attention and persistence over the coming decades. Meeting those challenges will require committed leadership. But who will lead? I believe that will be the United States, which has demonstrated its positive impact repeatedly in the past and is uniquely capable of carrying out that responsibility. No other nation has the clout and commitment to do so. Our efforts in foreign affairs, our use of soft power, and our engagement in the multilateral system should seek to ensure that the United States continues to lead through the rest of the 21st century. In the chapters that follow, I am going to offer specific solutions and specific steps that the United States must take. The United States must move swiftly and boldly, but wisely, efficiently, and with international support to build the global future based on common security, shared democratic values, sound economic principles, and broadly inclusive opportunities. Part 1. The Assessment. Chapter 1. The Wind from the East. China on the march. Beijing did not leverage its growing economic wealth for the sake of greater political freedom. It did not use its entry into the so-called rules-based global order to play by the rules. It did not mean what it said when it promised Hong Kong one country, two systems. It could not be trusted to honor business and academic partnerships without stealing intellectual property on a massive scale. It has not turned its development schemes in vulnerable foreign countries, from Ecuador to Montenegro, into lasting foundations for mutual goodwill, rather than one-way exploitation. Bret Stephens, New York Times, July 5th, 2021. China won't bury us either. When the leaders of the Myanmar military deposed the democratically elected government in a coup d'etat on February 1st, 2021, it made me rethink my own assumptions about the U.S. approach to development. As someone who built my career on the premise that support for development is a critical component of foreign policy, the coup struck me at once as a huge setback for both statecraft and development, and also a confirmation of so much that I had observed and believed in my work. It's tempting to try and draw conclusions and learn lessons from the events in Myanmar, but perhaps the only obvious lesson is that any assumptions that big, powerful countries might make about smaller, weaker, and poorer countries are likely wrong and arrogant. Leadership on an international level requires vigilance, care, and flexibility, as well as highly specialized knowledge, resources, and tools that vary and adapt to unique cultures, circumstances, and moments in history. Having secured its independence from British colonial rule in 1948, Myanmar was kept politically and culturally isolated from the global community by its ruling military junta. If Myanmar, or Burma, existed at all in the consciousness of the average American, it was most likely as the misty setting of a grainy old black-and-white movie. In reality, the country is larger and more significant in geopolitical terms than many realize. It shares a border with China on its northeast, and with India to its north and west. Myanmar offers a critical entry point into the Bay of Bengal and the Indian Ocean. For decades, the international community heard very little about numerous and often bloody insurrections in which the state-armed forces, the Tamado, fought to gain control over various ethnic groups seeking self-determination. The conflict with the Karen ethnic group has been going on for over 60 years and has been labeled by some as the world's longest-running civil war, although a fragile ceasefire was signed by the recently deposed civilian government. There is also a significant population of ethnic Chinese, a growing influx of Chinese nationals, and of course the widely publicized conflict with the Rohingya ethnic group, referred to by some observers as genocide in progress. For most of the period of its independence, American diplomats and development workers kept their distance from Myanmar, at least until the charismatic pro-democracy activist Aung San Suu Kyi rose to international prominence in the late 1980s, focusing the world's attention on Myanmar's secretive government and earning the 1991 Nobel Peace Prize in the process. Of course, she spent most of the next 20 years under house arrest, despite global outcry and appeals from prominent heads of state and 2 different UN Secretaries General. During that time, the United States pursued few, if any, of the soft power options it traditionally rolled out in other comparable countries. There were no specialists on the ground from the American Foreign Service, no educational exchange programs bringing the best and brightest of Myanmar's future leaders to the U.S. for study and training. Few, if any, American corporations setting up economic partnerships, entrepreneurs creating new enterprises, or NGOs establishing an operational foothold. No advisors sharing expertise on engineering, agriculture, environmental science, and no cultural exchange programs. We brought limited or no influence to encourage public or private financial institutions to invest in Myanmar's economic growth. These are the means by which the U.S. has provided support and assistance to many nations to begin climbing the ladder of development, simultaneously exposing people in those countries to values and knowledge, while remaining supporting actors in those nations' internal dramas. Having come to Washington in 2002, during the George W. Bush administration, I had completely bought into his ambition to promote democracy in the developing world, which President Bush spoke of in his second inaugural address. It had been a cornerstone of our foreign policy since FDR, and had been reiterated by Ronald Reagan, who established the National Endowment for Democracy in the early 1980s. I had made it a central part of my work at USAID. Countries at the second or third tier of perceived importance to the U.S. national interest became something of a specialty for me. My particular development work, putting together multi-stakeholder partnerships with philanthropies, organizations, and corporations, covered all sorts of development issues, including inclusive economic growth, democratic governance, human rights, and the rule of law in such countries. The U.S., for the time being, no longer driven by the dictates of global superpower competition, may have had its back turned, but Myanmar's great and powerful Asian neighbors did not. With its economy crippled by decades of trade and investment sanctions, Myanmar welcomed Chinese support. The Chinese government, for its part, didn't share the West's qualms about authoritarian governments and didn't hesitate to step in, pouring in financial, technical, and human resources. China supplies Myanmar's military and makes enormous investments in industries like oil and gas, mining, and agriculture, from which China itself stands to benefit greatly, not to mention the infrastructure needed to harness and transport those resources: roads, railways, pipelines, and power installations. China further supports Myanmar's economy by supplying a ready market for raw materials, such as rubber and lumber. And in contrast to the majority of the international community, China has refrained from condemning the abuses attributed to the Tatmadaw and has assumed the role of Myanmar's defender at the UN and other international organizations. One might expect that after so much bilateral trade, a cozy relationship would have developed between China and Myanmar's ruling generals. But here is where assumptions begin to break down. In time, the military leaders in Myanmar began to grow suspicious of China's motives and concerned about the growing and perhaps irreversible dependence on China. They resented being bullied by China, or any other outside power for that matter. Even a casual observer of recent Chinese relations with lower and middle-income nations would know those concerns were real and legitimate. China has established a track record of investing in massive infrastructure projects in smaller countries, projects that tend to serve its own needs more than the needs of the recipient country, in the form of natural resources, strategic position, or work for its own labor force. A case in point is the Hambantota Port project in Sri Lanka, for which China provided virtually all the funding beginning in 2015. The new port was a priority of Sri Lanka's leader at the time, but was considered something of a white elephant by most potential investors. When the port proved as unprofitable and unsuccessful as had been predicted and became an economic burden to Sri Lanka, China renegotiated its terms, securing for itself the rights to manage the port and adjacent facilities under a 99-year lease, similar to that which was extended to the United Kingdom for the territory of Hong Kong. The port added to Sri Lanka's already massive debt burden. The Hambantota project may have had little value to Sri Lanka, but to China it represented a toehold along the coast of the Indian Ocean, enabling shipping access to the South China Sea through the Strait of Malacca. The port would be a critical piece of China's string of pearls strategy, a planned series of ports and potential naval bases linking its eastern coast. The financial performance of the port has indeed improved somewhat under Chinese management, but it still was perceived by many China observers as the poster child for China's debt trap diplomacy, to use a phrase coined by Brahma Chelani, an Indian geopolitical expert. When I was asked,
"Sample complete. Ready to continue?"